So what I'm hoping to do with these sessions is just let you see like my workflow, see how I'm working, might run into some interesting code as I'm working on it. And at least once a month, we'll do some just open Q&A sessions where you can come in and have kind of group consulting, hear from other people about the projects they're working on and get questions answered. I think it should be pretty fun. I've done these for nonprofits for many years, starting at Greater Boston Legal Services and now at Suffolk. So I'm excited to see how it works in this kind of forum as well. So what I'm going to do is share my screen. I'm going to close some things that might pop up notifications. All right. And I thought it might be interesting for us to start with working on a couple of different kinds of issues that are in current interviews. Could also jump into like just working through an interview from start to finish. That's a little bit simpler and easier to digest, but we'll start with this one, which is the housing code checklist. So I'll just put a link to this on the chat, so you all can follow along. This is a public repository, the housing code checklist repository. And I'm going to show you the way that I work on this. I go to my development server here. And what I tend to do is to code locally using VS Code. And then I use the DocAssemble playground on the server that's always running in the cloud to be able to test the changes that I'm making interactively as I go along. It lets me work pretty quickly and efficiently, in my opinion. Taking advantage of things like GitHub Copilot and just the basic multi-file search features, just with a little bit more powerful editor in the form of VS Code. But I'm going to start by just checking to see, okay, this is not the interview I meant to open. Looking for the housing code checklist interview. So I'm going to go ahead and create actually forgot I named it UpToCode, my playground here. And I'm not sure how many of you, which kinds of environments most of you are on. I'm on a Windows PC. I like to use the Windows subsystem for Linux. So I have Ubuntu version 20. Let me count, see. Yeah. All right, 20.04 is what I'm running on this machine. So it's not quite the newest version of Ubuntu, but Windows subsystem for Linux lets you run a full Linux environment inside the Windows shell. You can share the file system between Windows and Linux, but just so much better than other experiences I've tried before. Like before this came out, there was something called Git Desktop, which included its own shell for Windows, but a lot trickier to use. All right, so I'm going to go into the housing code checklist folder, check out what branch I'm already on. I'm on the main branch, which is great. Let's just do a poll. And I'm going to make a new, so the issue that we're going to work on today is just allowing a tenant to have two addresses. And there is a feature in the assembly line already, which allows us to use two different addresses. So I'm going to take a look at whether that will fit the needs of our project today. I'm going to open up a new tab just to, sometimes the way I like to do this is to go to the assembly line documentation, because we do a pretty good job of keeping everything right there in the code API. I'll see if this is going to be in here. Essentially, what I want to do is look at the AL individual object and see if this attribute's listed there, which it is. So looking back at the issue, we wanted to capture the person's address where they are having the problem, and potentially another address where they want to get mail. So I would rephrase this issue description a little bit in order to capture that idea that the address where they live now, really they should be thinking of the primary address being the address where the problem is, not the address that they live in, if they happen to have moved out because of a problem. So I think we can keep the problem address as being just the normal address attribute of an individual. And then we could probably use this mailing address, which is a single address object, to handle the rest of the addresses that they want to provide. So let's take a look at that. And I didn't actually have to open up the code locally because I was able to get right to that feature by looking in the documentation, which is great. I'm going to open up VS Code. Let's see, we've had a few more folks join us, so welcome everybody. And we started the recording at the beginning, so if you want to come back and look at anything later, you'll be able to. All right. So I have not come up with a totally consistent way to name all of the files in an interview yet, although generally the main interview file for me matches the name of the repository. It doesn't in this case. Sometimes it's worth changing that around, and sometimes it's not. And what you'll see is this interview, this one that lets people enforce the housing code in Massachusetts, this interview incorporates a lot of different methods for enforcing the housing code. So each of those separate methods, like sending a demand letter, just a simple repair letter, filing some motions or a complaint against your landlord, those live in their own YAML files. But we're talking about here is shared code that's going to go right in this main file, the housing code interview file. Before I actually touch any of the code, I'm going to make a new branch on GitHub. So a little bit different from the workflow in the docassemble playground. In the playground, you would make the changes and then push them to a new branch. When you're using the Git command line tool, you create the branch first. So I'll just make a new branch, and I'll call it additional address. And let's take a look and see if we can figure out what we want to do here. So when we ask for the person's address, let's see if we have a custom screen for that, or if we're using the built-in docassemble address for that. And this is actually something I haven't done usability testing on to see what people prefer, but I think it's nice to let people know when they provide their address that they can provide a different kind of address later on its own screen.
Quinten, I'm assuming that this, what I'm seeing is with the green marks on your line numbers, this is an integration of a extension for GitHub into VSC. Is that what I'm seeing?
You're looking over here on the right, and you're seeing the highlighted lines.
On the left. On the left side, so on your line numbers, 215, 216, 217, 218, is this an extension that's doing that? It looks like the GitHub change,
right here, I see. Yeah, there's one there as well. Yeah. Yep. So I do have the GitHub integration turned on here.
Okay.
And great question. Got a bunch of extensions here, but I think that the GitHub ones I installed just were like once I started working in a Git repository. with VS Code, it suggests that you install extensions to work with Git. So I just click the button to install those.
Okay.
I'm happy to share this list. You can see I have 52 extensions installed, probably a lot of which are redundant. Oh no, actually, we're looking at my Ubuntu. So that's actually 9 extensions. So actually, it's a smaller list. I'm not sure why. Well, we can look at that later to see. I'm thinking there was an extension for GitHub, but I'm not seeing it listed here. Maybe it's now built into VS Code.
Yeah, if you look on the further left, there's that little branching icon just above. If you click on that, that's the source control tab that is linked to Git. But yeah.
That's right. Yeah. Do you happen to remember if there's a separate extension you need to install, or is this just built into VS Code now?
That's a good question. I'm also not sure. I've also got it installed, I think. Yeah, sorry, I'm not sure.
All right. So what I think I'm going to do is put a checkbox here that lets someone say that they have a separate mailing address. So it's right there on the same screen, and they know they'll be able to put in different information. This is a pattern which I'm trying to standardize too. And actually, there's a new feature in the assembly line that helps you with this standardization. At least it's in progress. I'm trying to remember if I finished and published that change. But we created a variable called person answering, and it's just a radio button that lets you say whether you're the tenant or another person helping the tenant. And it lets us use direct address where it works. From like usability research, using direct address can really help make an interview feel more approachable and provide a better experience. So it's a lot of effort to have conditional language. I try to think about ways I can write the language so that I don't need to use pronouns some of the time, because it can be a little bit repetitive, gives you twice as much to translate. But using direct address really improves the experience for the tenant or whoever it is that's using your interview. And one other thing that I'll mention here, this is something that we kind of thought through and talked with folks who are multilingual and who do translation. You really do need to translate full sentences. So you might have seen inside DocAssemble, there's some features that allow you to, that are language aware. They translate some phrases into at least Spanish, German, and French, I believe, are the 4, and as well as English that it supports. There's features that let you do things like pluralization and in a language aware way, but you can't do it in isolation. And another thing you really can't do is have like an inline if statement that says you, the other person, like if I couldn't have changed this conditional logic so it was just around the word you or your, even if it made sense in English, because many languages have totally different orders of those different parts of speech. So it really is required to make sure your interview is fully translatable, that you use full sentences and you don't put conditional logic in the middle of a sentence. And as I'm saying that, I'm thinking like if this provokes questions or thoughts or other ideas, feel free to unmute and jump in. Also feel free to use the chat if you're like, oh, I don't want to interrupt with this idea, but I'm happy to like kind of hear from other people's experiences with this kind of usability feature. So I think that what I'm going to do here is use the label feature in order to allow me to follow the same pattern of having conditional logic and use direct address when I'm asking the person about their mailing address. Tiny detail, Caroline Robinson kind of has persuaded me of this idea of using get as one of the best words you can use as a plain language term in English. Instead of kind of as lawyers, it's common to want to use a fancier expression like receive. The other thing that you might notice here is that I say you in the question, but when the person is answering, I use I. And again, that's just like following a common pattern in forms where it's important to be consistent in how the user is going to be reading the text of your interview. This is my preferred address. And I think it's also easier for a tenant, or like I say tenant, but for a person to interact with when the answer looks like them, right? Like if I'm checking this because I have something. If you say you again, it's going to be a little bit harder for the person to read and slow them down. Now, I don't remember is whether we have any feature built in to say that somebody has a mailing address. I think what we have is the opposite, actually, which is where we have on the mailing address screen, we ask the person if the mailing address is the same as their personal address. But I don't think I like to do that on this interview. I think we'll have a better flow, as I said, if we make it so that the question that asks about their address clearly says that they'll be able to talk about their mailing address in the same place. I think it's going to be easier for a person to interact with. Something that we probably won't be able to test in this interview. We've done a round of usability testing, and we're now in kind of the refining stage. And I think there's not budget for more usability testing, unfortunately. But maybe in another interview, we'll be able to check that out. So there's no existing. Actually, let me just check this. Maybe there is. Here we can show another VS Code window. We'll look in the assembly line repository, which I previously synced to this computer. And just look in the question library here. No, okay. We're using the object selection pattern. So there's no existing variable that stores whether someone has a separate mailing address. So we'll make one up for this interview. I'm thinking through this now. Like, well, is there a good place where, was there a good reason why we use that pattern of asking for the mailing address and storing it in an object, like we do here in the default question in the assembly line? And I think the nice thing about this is that it gets set to the same object as the person's address. But we can still get that same pattern. We'll just do it a little bit differently. I think here's another decision point, right? Do we want to have this be a simple checkbox, which is a little bit unobtrusive and the person can skip over if they don't want to interact with it? Or do we want to force them to make a choice on this question about whether they have a separate mailing address? And I think I already have leaned a certain way, just the way that I wrote this. I think we're going to try it as a checkbox. Let's just see what it looks like with that choice. Okay. And then I'm going to try this for now. I'm not sure if I totally think this is the right choice, but I think if the person says they don't have a separate mailing address, we'll set the mailing address object to be equal to the address. I don't usually use validation code for setting variables like that. I think it should be okay here though. So on this screen here, we ask for the person's mailing address. We never need to ask them to select an address they've already told us about because there won't be any address of that kind. We can just ask for their address in the normal way. Okay. Now I'm going to use a tool called the DocAssemble CLI, which I'll drop a link to that in the chat. I think that there's some instructions here about how to install it. Yep, it's on PyPI and all the installation instructions are there. So if you're using the command line interface, you can use this tool to kind of sync the code that you're working on locally with the playground, as I mentioned at the beginning, in order to allow you to test it. So I have multiple servers that I push code to. So I'm going to have to say the server name. You don't have to specify the server name if you only have one server you're pushing code to with the DA install command. I'm going to say that I'm pushing the code to the playground. And I'm going to say the name of the project, which is UpToCode. And then the name of the folder that I'm going to push. I'm already in the folder. So I'm just going to use dot to refer to the local current directory. And this is going to put all of the code that I've been working on into this location in a playground on this server. And then I'll be able to click the run button once it's finished uploading. Because in this particular project, I have multiple Python modules, and I'm doing a full installation, it's going to have to restart the server after it finishes uploading the code in order to get it to see the module that I've just added. So that does take a bit longer. If you know that you're not making any changes to the Python module, or if there just are no, if you know that you're not making changes to a Python module, you can add another parameter, which tells it not to restart. It's just called no restart. If you don't have any Python modules, you don't have to worry about that. It's smart enough to know not to push that code up for you. All right, and then after this is finished, we'll be able actually to run the interview. Except for one important detail, which is I'm not actually asking for the mailing address yet in my interview flow, so I better do that first. So what I want to do is look for all the places where I'm asking for the address, and I'm going to have to refresh in my mind the logic of this interview, basically what the flowchart is. So it looks like here I'm asking for the address if they've gotten through some of the triage questions, asking if the landlord knows about the problem, and if all they're asking for is getting the report that they can download and look at later, which just basically documents all the problems that they wanted to tell the landlord about. So that's one branch. And if they happen to run this branch that asks for the report and they run the organized tenants branch, we'll ask for the address. Looks like we're asking for it really just in those few places. Let's see. Any place that we're explicitly asking for this, we do want to make sure we ask for the mailing address in the same place. Do a little split screen here. Okay. There might be more references in separate standalone interview order blocks. But let's start just by testing our little change out. And actually, this is a good chance for me to show you. This will make sure we select the report. I'll be able to show you that parameter that I mentioned. So I usually just keep it at the end with my command line. So that way I can just hit the up arrow and delete or retype that command. And you'll notice this time it went much faster. We didn't even get a single dot. All right, I guess we got one little dot instead of 8 or 9.
Out of interest, Quinten, why don't you use DA watch install?
So mostly because I'm not the only person using my development server. And if I am working on Python modules, it's a little distracting. It just slows down the server for a little bit, but that's the main reason. Great question. Yeah, Ryan's mentioned that there's a command DA watch install, which will upload whatever you're working on every time that you make a change. It's not super smart though. It doesn't do a differential in upload. It creates a zip file of all the contents of your directory and then uploads them. In some of my folders that would be more significant in terms of the size of the upload. This one, it wouldn't really be a big deal because let's see. It's 11 megabytes. So that would totally be fine to upload. I think maybe it's smart enough to upload the .git directory. That might be a change that Bryce Willie, who's on our team at Suffolk, might have added. Okay, so now that I'm here in the playground, if I've used the DA install command, it's important that I don't do save and run because it will show whatever the code is here. Will be overwriting the change that I made on VS Code. So I'm going to click the run button here, which doesn't save first. If I wanted to not have to remember that, I could just always refresh on this screen. And then this code would have the latest changes. But it doesn't update the code in this window unless you hit the refresh button. So that blue run button is a workaround for that. And what are the benefits of default state and country? Good question from Tony a few minutes ago. So the benefit is, well, first of all, this code that I was copying from here, which has those defaults in place. We don't know if the person who uses it will have address auto-completion turned on. So that's probably the primary reason. I think it's also kind of nice to give a small signal to the user that we're expecting an address in this state. Not super important, but it is slightly nice to do. Or Jane Smith has every problem that in the world because I always use her as a test name for all of my interviews. Okay, so I'm just going to select a few housing problems. I'm going to say, yes, it was there when I moved in because it prompts fewer questions. And I'm going to skip. If I did explore more problems, for those of you who haven't seen this interview, it takes me to a menu where I can kind of go more in depth into each of those areas, but I'm going to go right to the end. This is that triage I was talking about. So I'm going to just say that, yes, I do want to print a copy of my checklist for later. And we should see very few questions, but one of them will be our address. And if I say no, it should let me keep going because that validation code set the mailing address for me if I didn't check that checkbox. But if I go back and I say, I do have another address where I get mail, it should ask me for the mailing address. Perfect. It's just what I wanted. This is great, actually, because now, see, this is where having that workflow where you do push to the playground and run the code regularly is helpful, because I don't like lines in the question area, that larger font size, I think it's an H2, to wrap. I think that, and they certainly shouldn't have two separate sentences. So that was just a small mistake that I made here. So I'm going to copy the conditional logic there, but I'm going to move the conditional question to the sub-question area. This actually gets to another good usability thing. So if you look at eye scanning, and Nielsen Norman Group has some really good research on this that I look at. I can still use that no restart command because I didn't change a Python module. People don't, so when you have choices of text to read on the screen, I think right now our eye is drawn right to this headline, right? And we probably would read at least the first part of it. We'd probably skip the second part. Or we might skim it and just get a couple of keywords there. And again, address is right there on the first line. I probably wouldn't really see that clarification. But now that I've put that in the sub-question area, it's no longer a bold heading font. This is closer. Because again, you could also think of this as being related to basic principles of design, contrast, repetition, alignment, and proximity. This is closer to the place where the person wants to type. Their eyes are immediately drawn to those places as well. Those are also highlights if you do eye fixation studies. So there's a good chance that the person might read just this and they wouldn't read the heading. And I find that I have to write, when I have both a question and a sub-question area, I have to really think that through and make sure that I'm using the right level of information in both places so that the question will be answered accurately regardless of what part of it draws their attention. I also try to think about keeping it short, under 100 words for sure, but really as few words as I can so that they will just get the gist of what I'm trying to say and they'll use the form correctly. So I think we're pretty safe here. We have what is your address. We have the address where you're having the problems you want to report. And again, this is actually nice how DocAssemble highlights this checkbox in this case, although I don't always like it. This is also a clear focal point so that I have another address where I get mail. It's going to be another signal to help the person use this input correctly. There's another thing that we can do here, which is actually described on the issue. I might have used two issues for this. It says, should the tenant's address only be in Massachusetts? And I do agree with that feedback, especially now that we allow the person to provide multiple addresses. So let's make that change. Now that we confirm we're seeing the right thing, we can add that validation. So I like to just use lambda expressions for validation, but you can use a function as it's just it's just a preference thing. But I like that how concise it can be. And I don't write those so often. So what I would actually do here is I would take a look and make sure, well, sometimes I might look at the documentation to make sure I'm using it correctly. And sometimes I would just run it. It's actually short enough just to run. Just do trial and error this time. When you use the DA install command, it does like docassemble knows to reload and recompile this interview when you've run the DA install command. So you don't have to go back to the playground and do anything like saving. I can just reload on the screen and my new code will be there. So let's just test the validation here. So it's very simple validation. It's not checking for a valid address in the world. It's just checking the individual parts of the address and seeing if they're right. Okay, so here, please enter a valid value. Great. I hate that message though. And I definitely don't remember the syntax for a validation message without double checking. I think it's validation messages, but let's just see. Oh, okay. I'm forgetting. I could use validation messages, I think. But actually, because I have this custom Lambda, that's probably better just to do it right here. Yeah, okay. Make sure I have the right name function. There is a problem with this. I wonder if anyone notices the issue with me using that function there. Well, to me, I think the problem is it's not going to be translatable. This interview is going to be at least in Spanish. So that validation message won't be translated, but I might just open an issue for that and come up with a different solution later. And I saw Kelly had a question about good resources for usability. And great question. So there is this guide here, which I'll share. Our own good questions guide. I don't think we have anything in there about sub-question versus question area though. But yeah, I'll share that link. We did use the UK style guide quite a bit. I think I really like that. UK.gov is amazing, consistent, not flashy, but very good consistency. And the person who did a lot of that work, Caroline Jarrett, also helped write similar content for the Australian web design. And I've linked to their book here, Caroline Jarrett, and her co-author, Jerry Gaffney, on this page. So some good places. And then I mentioned Nielsen Norman Group. If you haven't run into that already, nngroup.com. Kind of early researchers in this area, really great content for usability. no substitute for testing your own stuff. We're lucky enough to be able to have a budget to do usability testing on this interview. And another tenants right project in Missouri. Don't always get that luxury, but it's definitely worth it. And you can get a really good result with just a few testers. And even if you don't have access to paid testers, testing people who you work with and aren't the regular users of your product, you'll still learn a lot from just testing them and watching them. And we have some information about how to do usability tests on this website as well. So I've linked to in the chat. Okay, so this is looking really good so far. To tie it up, I'm going to actually have to make use of that in at least one or two of the templates. So what I've done here from WSL, the fastest way for me to get to the folder where I'm actually working, I could type this path in by hand, WSL string. I think there's also this Linux folder here, so I can navigate to it that way. But it's just really handy to be able to just say open up Explorer in the current folder. So that's what this does here. Dot is current folder, explorer.exe is the name of the Windows file manager tool, as well as what controls the start menu and everything. And okay. Let's take a look at one of the templates and let's see. I know that with the letter to request an inspection, it's going to be important to use the person's mailing address. So remember what we did in the interview. We are always defining the value of the mailing address. Sometimes it's the same literal same object as the user's physical address, and sometimes it's a different object, but it's always defined. And let's just look at the logic that we have here. We're looking at the person's address and the name of the city. And this is going to be the address where they're having the problem. Normalized address is a function that looks at the person's address. And if they've hand typed an address, which does happen even with address autocompletion, it's going to run it through Google Google Maps various functions to geocode it and make it in a standardized form. Just like, not for mailing, like the US Postal Service has an API to do that. This is just getting it to match Google Maps database. But that should work for us here. And then we want to change this to be the mailing address. Now, one thing that I do see here is we ask them to do an inspection. But we don't say what the address of the location is. So maybe we want to have a little conditional logic here. We might want to do something a little bit different. So I kind of like this for right now. We could probably keep revisiting that and see if we are happy with what it looks like. But now we've just changed the letter to request inspection. I want to just see the status of that small change that I made before I make any more changes in other documents. So let me go ahead and check that out. One of the first things I'm going to have to do is to change the documents that I'm working on because I didn't actually generate that letter to the inspector. And sometimes when you do this restarting and you try to refresh too early, you do get this spinning wheel and it doesn't always resolve on its own. So let's just try another refresh. Lovely error. Could mean that I had a syntax error. Let's try refreshing the playground screen. Okay, great. All right, it is working now. Slow. And so, yeah, to Ryan's earlier question, this is kind of why I don't always have it installed constantly, unless I'm. So, like, there could be some different workflows. You see, I'm on WSL. I could run Docker locally, and then I wouldn't care how many times I uploaded the changes, but it happens to run pretty slowly in that environment, Docker, when you're running it on Windows through WSL. I think there probably are some ways I can optimize it and make it work better, but I haven't gotten through all of those. Okay, so I've unselected the report, and now I just want to do the letter to the inspector. Okay, so we chose, let me actually see what address is. I chose an address in Boston, for where the problem is, an address in Chelsea. Yeah, well, I can just say, pretend it's an address in Chelsea. Okay, and here I can just look at this preview. So it's addressed to Boston, which is correct. And it's correctly saying my mailing address, and it correctly says the address to inspect. So, okay, great. So we should be able to copy that logic into more of the templates, and it should work. I'm going to just push this up here, check to see if I've changed what I wanted to change. Somehow I've added these files. Let me just remove those. I think I accidentally. Did that when I was trying to open up, show you how to navigate to WSL folders. This does kind of work a little bit more out of the box on a Mac, unless you're running an M1 Mac, where you get to have different fun issues dealing with Docker running, because it's an ARM-based system rather than Intel. Okay, let's check our changes again. Okay, so we'll push up that change to GitHub there. And something I didn't do, but I probably could have, is to link that question to the issue. but sorry. I might just do that here, because I do prefer to have commits linked to the thing I'm working with. Actually, copy the commit hash. And I don't need that whole link. I could just have the hash, and it should link to it. All right, that's probably a good place to pause on this.